They fired me after 18 years to save money, said 3 juniors could do my job. 2 weeks later, the entire system collapsed, and they were begging me to come back. They called it a quarterly check-in, but I knew something was off the second. I saw the meeting invite. No agenda, no attachments. Just a calendar block from Graham Vickers, our newly minted CTO, marked simply, Touch Base. I'd been at Veltria Housing for 18 years. I'd survived 3 CEOs, 2 acquisitions, and more than a few bad quarters. But this felt different. You learn to sense when the floor is about to give. The hallway outside his office was too quiet. The receptionist wouldn't meet my eyes. Graham's office was pristine, modern, sterile, all sharp lines and polished. Chrome. Not a single cable out of place. A laptop, a water bottle, a decorative stone that probably cost more than my monitor. The guy had only been here 6 months and already acted like he owned the building. He looked up when I entered, forced a tight smile. "Victor, thanks for coming in." HR was already there. Diane. Folder on the table. That was the moment I knew. For sure. Graham gestured to the seat across from him. "Let's make this quick." I sat, spine straight, hands calm even though my heart was trying to climb out of my chest. "We've been reviewing departmental budgets," he began. "You know how things are. Cost pressures, investor expectations, the usual." I said nothing. Let him talk. He folded his hands. "To be frank, your salary is, well, we could hire 3 junior engineers for what we pay you. Talented grads, eager, trainable." There it was. No preamble, no sugarcoating. "Just the knife. Nothing personal," he added, as if that made a difference. "This is a business decision." Diane slid the folder across the table like she was serving me my own obituary. 2 months severance, she said. Plus accrued. Vacation. We've also included a letter of reference and details on your 401k options. I picked up the folder, gave it a cursory glance, then set it on my lap. "Is that all you have to say?" Graham blinked, clearly thrown by the question. Maybe he expected me to argue, threaten legal action, flip the desk, something dramatic, something he could justify to the board. Most people in your position have questions, concerns. I shrugged. Seems pretty straightforward. Silence. Graham looked to Diane as if hoping she'd take over. She stayed quiet. The truth was, I wasn't calm. I was just done. There's a difference. I'd seen this coming. The moment they brought in Graham with his MBA and buzzwords about efficiency and streamlining, I knew the old guard was on borrowed time. I just didn't think I'd be the first one cut. "We'd appreciate your help with the transition," Graham added, like a man offering a shovel to the guy he just buried. "The new team could use some guidance on the architecture." "Consulting?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He nodded. "If you're open to it, just for a few weeks." "I'll think about it," I said, knowing I wouldn't. We shook. Hands, mine steady, his slightly damp, and I walked out. My office felt smaller than I remembered. 18 years and all of it fit into one cardboard box. A few framed certificates. A stress ball I never used. The mug my daughter gave me when she was 9. World's coolest nerd. I slipped it in carefully, making sure it wouldn't crack. I nodded at a few colleagues on the way out. Some nodded back. Most looked away. Maybe they were afraid of what they saw. A mirror of what might happen to them. The walk to the parking garage felt longer than usual. My badge still worked. I wondered how long that would last. When the elevator doors closed, I finally let myself breathe. In the driver's seat, I rested, my hands on the wheel, and stared at the concrete wall in front of me. I'd been with the company longer than anyone on the executive team, built every system they used, laid the foundation, the wiring, the damn blueprint for how it all ran. And they tossed me out like an outdated plug-in. They said it wasn't personal, but 18 years felt personal to me. I got home before 4 that day. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels too big. I set the box from work on the kitchen counter and just stared at it for a moment, like it might move. Like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, and the moment I blinked, I'd find myself back in my office, with the hum of the server logs and the faint clicking of keys around me. But the box stayed still. I poured a bourbon, neat, generous, and headed out to the back deck. The late afternoon light was soft and gold, stretching across Lake Ontario, like it was trying to smooth everything out. It didn't work. I sat down in the same chair I always used on weekends, the one with the faint tear in the cushion I always meant to fix. The lake rippled quietly, still water that never really is. Beneath the calm, there's always a current, something shifting, building. Elaine came out a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She sat beside me and didn't say anything right away. That's always been one of her strengths, knowing when silence works better than comfort. Eventually, she asked, "So?" I didn't look at her. "They let me go." Her hand found mine. "I'm sorry," I took a sip. "Not surprised, just tired." "What reason did they give?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Too expensive. They can hire 3 juniors for my salary." She nodded, lips pressed together. "And none of those juniors have the faintest idea what's buried inside those systems, do they?" I looked at her then. "Nope." She studied me for a moment. "You're not angry," I tilted my head. "Aren't I?" "No, you're wounded. It's different." I didn't answer. I couldn't. She was right, though. I wasn't raging or yelling. I wasn't plotting revenge or snapping pencils in half. I was grieving. And that's the thing no one talks about. Losing a job like that isn't just losing a paycheck. It's losing something you built. Something that carried your fingerprints, your ideas, your care. What Graham didn't understand, what he didn't even bother to ask, was that those systems weren't just code. They were craft. I'd built redundancy protocols into places no one knew existed. Security layers under security layers. And because the company always shot down my proposals for a documentation team, too expensive, it meant I was the only one who really knew how it all worked. It wasn't out of ego. It was necessity. The company asked for miracles, then refused to fund the tools to make them last. I didn't make myself indispensable. They did. Every time they said next quarter to my documentation request. Every time they asked me to just get it done. Every time they brought in consultants who nodded at my diagrams and left without understanding a single thing. Phone buzzed. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. I finally looked. It was Alan. "Alan. This is Vic. The whole team's freaking out. No one knows how the backup scheduler ties into the tenant portal. They're guessing." I stared at the message for a long moment. Alan had been with me for over a decade. Smart guy. Honest. Quiet. He never tried to climb ladders or play politics. He just wanted to build things that worked. I had personally recruited him after a system failure at a sister company exposed how fragile their data architecture was. He'd stuck with me through everything. I didn't reply. Elaine saw me staring at the screen. "Trouble?" "Just Alan." I said. "The new team's panicking." "Already?" I nodded. "They'll hit a wall every day for the next year." She looked back at the lake, thoughtful. "You ever think about going back?" I shook my head. "I left everything I owed them in that box." She squeezed my hand. "And everything they needed in your head." That sat between us for a while. The lake shimmered in the low sun, deceptively still. Just like me. They thought I was expensive. Turns out, ignorance costs more. I started at Bayview Properties in 2006, back when their entire IT operation consisted of 2 dusty desktop computers, a fax machine, and a DSL modem that needed to be rebooted every other day. They owned 4 apartment complexes then, 12 employees. Rent checks were mailed in. Maintenance requests were handled on Post-it notes. Their idea of digital infrastructure was an Excel sheet someone updated when they remembered. I'd been working as a freelance systems consultant in Syracuse at the time, bouncing between unstable contracts. I was tired of packing up every 6 months and starting over. Harold Bay, the company's founder, met me in a cramped office above a strip mall. He wore a wool blazer despite the heat and handed me a coffee that tasted like burnt plastic. But he looked me in the eye when he spoke. "I don't need flashy," he said. "I need solid. We're going to expand, and I want someone who can build something we won't have to rip out 2 years later." I took the job on the spot. Over the next 18 years, I built everything from the ground up. A custom property management system that could scale, automated rent processing, a maintenance ticketing platform with escalation tiers and priority filters, tenant background checks integrated with public record databases, a custom-built scheduling module for on-site staff that prevented overlap and cut payroll errors by. And every time we grew, another complex, another region, I adjusted the architecture, scaled it, protected it, hardened it. At our peak, we managed 63 properties across 4 states, all running on a single unified infrastructure. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And it could have worked for another 20 years if they'd just left it alone. I trained a lot of people along the way. Young engineers, interns, some stayed, some didn't. I didn't mind explaining things if they wanted to learn. What got under my skin were the ones who didn't ask questions, who thought they could understand a decade's worth of design decisions by skimming the UI. I kept requesting a documentation team, said we needed full specs, diagrams, redundancy playbooks, offboarding logs. Every time it was the same answer. 2. Expensive. Let's revisit next quarter, but that quarter never came. Instead, I kept doing it myself. I wrote partial documentation, updated internal wikis, annotated the most critical components. But I was also doing 2 full-time jobs, building and maintaining. The company had no idea how close they came to disaster more than once. A single, missed line of code, a skipped checksum, a broken failover loop. I caught them all. When Harold retired in 2017, I hoped his son, Justin Bayou, would carry the same torch. But Justin was smoother. MBA forward-thinking, wore suits with no socks and said things like strategic pivot in casual conversation. He didn't want to run the company. He wanted to sell it. By 2019, Bayview Properties became Veltria Housing. A sleek name, new logo, company-wide rebrand. They brought in private equity money, restructured the board, and turned every long-term decision into a short-term math problem. Justin stayed on for a while, mostly in a marketing capacity. But the people holding the real power were the investors, guys who didn't know the difference between system architecture and interior design. Culture shifted overnight. No more handshake meetings. No more do it right, not fast. Suddenly, it was all about quarterly results, burn rates, headcounts. They kept me on. Initially out of respect for what I'd built, I think. But eventually, I became a line item they couldn't justify. They started bringing in outside consultants. Bright-eyed kids who spoke in jargon and gave advice based on articles they read that morning. They'd sit in meetings while I explained our custom network stack and nod like they understood, then suggest migrating everything to a generic cloud platform that couldn't support half our dependencies. I kept speaking up, kept trying to explain. But somewhere along the line, they stopped listening. It wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a change in philosophy. When Harold was in charge, the first question was always, how does it work? Now the only question was, what does it cost? And eventually, the answer to both was me. It didn't happen all at once. First, they started moving meetings to more convenient times, which just happened to always conflict with my recurring check-ins or client calls. Then the invites stopped coming altogether. I'd only hear about key project decisions after they were already finalized. I'd walk by the glass conference room and see them in there. Graham, a couple of managers, some people I didn't even recognize. I'd nod as I passed. They'd avoid eye contact like I was interrupting something sacred. I told myself it was a phase, new leadership, new habits, temporary turbulence. Then Graham brought in the junior engineers, 3 of them, all fresh out of school. Shiny laptops, matching corporate polos, nervous smiles. He introduced them during a department check-in, one of the few I was still invited to at the time. These are some promising young minds, Graham said, like he was unveiling new tablets from the mountain. They'll be shadowing Victor for a bit to get up to speed on the legacy systems. Legacy systems. That phrase again. To them, what I'd built wasn't a framework. It was a relic. A black box that needed cracking open and migrating to something trendier, easier to explain to investors. They're just here to learn, Graham assured me when I confronted him later. It'll take the pressure off you. But I wasn't stupid. He wasn't planting support, he was setting up replacements. I did my job anyway. I walked them through the high-level design, explained how the tenant database interfaced with the background check API, how rent processing cascaded through the payment queue into the reporting dashboards, how maintenance workflows were prioritized based on unit status, staff schedules, and previous service records. Two of them nodded like they understood, but it was all surface. They took notes like they were cramming for an exam they'd never do again. Only one of them, Miguel, really listened. He asked questions that mattered. Not just what does this do, but why did you design it that way? And what would happen if this failed and we tried to patch it externally? He got it. I started staying a little longer after hours when Miguel was around. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I missed what it felt like to talk to someone who wanted to understand. But even Miguel couldn't stop the wave coming. One Friday afternoon, I saw a project roadmap posted in the shared drive. I wasn't on it. Systems migration, staff restructuring, vendor onboarding. It was all laid out like my name had already been scrubbed from the file. That night over dinner, I told Elaine about it. She was silent for a moment, then asked, "You still think they need you?" I frowned. "Of course they do. You're not listening to what they're showing you," she said. "They're pushing you out." I waved it off. "The new guys don't even understand how the system layers interact. Miguel's sharp, but the others? They think RESTful APIs solve everything. They're in for a rude awakening the first time. A back-end service crashes mid-cycle." She didn't smile. "And when it does, they'll call you, but by then it'll be too late. For them, not for you." I wanted to believe I was still essential, that the systems I'd built couldn't run without me. But what I realized painfully was that they didn't care if they failed. They didn't believe failure was possible. Not for them. I kept trying. I built diagrams, held one-on-one walkthroughs, offered to document core modules in my off time. But none of it stuck. Graham sat through one of my sessions and spent half of it checking his watch. When I explained the cascading priority logic behind the maintenance scheduler, he interrupted with, "Is that something we could just rebuild in something simpler? Maybe off the shelf?" I stared at him for a second too long. Simpler than a system that's run clean for 8 years? He didn't answer. It wasn't just that they didn't understand. It's that they didn't think they needed to. It took less than 2 weeks. I was in my home office updating my resume, something I hadn't done in over a decade, when the first voicemail came in. Graham's voice clipped and awkward. "Victor, we're having a few hiccups with the tenant portal. The junior team's working on it, but they're hitting some snags. Was hoping we could chat. Just a quick consultation." I didn't respond. A few hours later, another voicemail. This one from Diane in HR. "Hi, Victor, I hope you're doing well. We were wondering if you might be open to a short-term consulting arrangement. Nothing too involved. Just a few hours to help smooth the transition." Still didn't respond. That evening, a third call. Graham again. He sounded less rehearsed now, a little strained. "Victor, we're escalating here. Maintenance requests aren't processing properly, and the database queries are returning timeouts. It's affecting tenant service. We really need your insight." I listened to the message, deleted it, and went back to my resume. The next day, my phone blew up. 4 voicemails, 3 texts, 1 email marked urgent in all caps. The subject line, consulting offer, 300 hour, minimum 4-hour engagement. Showed it to Elaine. She handed me a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table across from me. "What are you thinking?" I looked out the window. The lake was calm again. Smooth silver, like it had nothing to prove. "I'm thinking they're finding out exactly what I'm worth." She smiled. Not smug, just quietly proud. "You going to help them?" I shook my head. "They made a business decision. So did I." Another day passed. The messages got more desperate. One of the juniors emailed me directly. We can't trace the back-end loop that triggers scheduled maintenance tickets. It looks custom. Any chance you could point us in the right direction?" I didn't reply. That evening, another offer came through, this time from Diane again. $500 an hour. "Whatever it takes," she said. "Name your terms." I almost laughed. They were willing to pay me more per hour than I'd ever made full-time. And for what? To fix problems they swore I wasn't worth keeping around to prevent? Considered responding. Not for the money, just to say no. But I didn't have to. That night, right as Elaine and I were setting the table for dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there he was. Graham Vickers, in person. His designer glasses were slightly askew. His tie was loosened, and his suit, always pristine, looked like he'd slept in it. "Victor," he said, trying to muster some composure. "I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but what are you doing here?" I asked flatly. "We have an emergency situation. The tenant portal is down. Nothing's syncing. The team's locked out of several admin functions. We've had complaints all day. Dozens of them." I leaned against the doorframe. "That sounds serious." "It is," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We need your help." I said nothing. "The board has authorized a full consulting fee, $500 an hour, whatever it takes. Just for a few days." Behind me, Elaine stood silently in the hallway, arms crossed. I thought about the box in my garage, the mug, the unsigned thank you card from Harold Bay. The folder HR had slid across the table like a tip. I thought about nothing personal. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles," I said quietly, "but I have an interview tomorrow." He blinked. "Victor," I closed the door. I didn't slam it, I just closed it. And for the first time since they let me go, I felt calm. Not smug. Not vindicated, just still. The email came 2 days after I closed the door on Graham. Subject line: "We should talk." Sender: Lawrence Devlin, CTO of Devlin Systems. I'd heard of them. Fast-growing property management software company out of Rochester. They handled fewer properties than Veltria, but they were expanding quickly and had a reputation for clean design and brutal reliability. Lawrence's message was short and to the point. "Victor, I heard about your departure from Veltria. We've followed your work from afar and admired what you built there. If you're open to a conversation, I'd love to buy you a coffee." I replied the same day. We met at a cafe downtown. Nothing fancy. No startup vibes, no beanbag chairs or chalkboard menus. Just two guys at a wooden table with a pot of regular coffee between them. Lawrence was in his mid-40s, clean-cut, direct, no frills. I liked him immediately. He didn't waste time. "We don't need flash," he said, stirring his coffee. "We need stable." Veltria had both until they forgot which one mattered. I raised an eyebrow. "You've been following them closely. We share a few clients, Westbrook Properties for one. They're not happy with how things are going. Word is, they're looking to jump ship." I leaned back. "I built the systems Westbrook depends on. If they leave, Veltria's going to feel it." Lawrence nodded. "Which is why we're preparing. They reached out to us, and we're confident we can handle their portfolio, but only if we have the right infrastructure. And the right person to lead the build." "You want me?" I said flatly. "Yes," he said. "Chief Systems Architect. Full creative control. You design it, you build it your way. No committees, no middlemen." I let that settle. The offer? 20% above your Veltria salary, stock options, full benefits, and we don't nickel and dime documentation. That last part got my attention. I narrowed my eyes. "I won't build another black box. We document everything: internals, dependencies, data pipelines, fallback paths. I won't leave a future version of me stuck trying to explain what no one else bothered to understand." He smiled. "That's exactly why we want you." We shook hands before the coffee got cold. I didn't post it online. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't need to. The satisfaction wasn't in the offer. It was in what it meant. They hadn't just seen the fire Veltria had walked into. They'd seen the scaffolding I left behind. The next morning, I walked into my new office at Devlin's. Downtown headquarters. It wasn't big. No corner windows or leather chairs, but the walls were bare and the whiteboard was clean. A blank slate. A system waiting to be built the right way. Elaine called me during lunch. "How's it feel?" she asked. I looked around, smiled. Feels like breathing again. Revenge. Taste good? I laughed. Not revenge, just proof. A week into my new role at Devlin, Alan showed up at my office. Laptop bag slung over his shoulder, dark circles under his eyes. I stood to greet him. "You look like hell. You should see Graham." We grabbed sandwiches at a deli around the corner. He didn't touch his food. "It's worse than you think," he said quietly, almost like he was afraid someone would overhear. "They've lost access to historical data going back 3 years. The backups are corrupted. No one knows why." I wasn't surprised. I had designed those backup protocols with redundancies, multi-step processes to avoid unauthorized overwrites. But they were delicate. Miss one part of the chain, and the whole thing failed on purpose to protect data, not destroy it. What happened? They skipped steps, didn't understand what they were doing, tried to restore from a partial clone without validating. Checksums. It overwrote the clean files. I nodded slowly. They'll never recover it. Alan reached into his bag and pulled out his laptop. That's not all. He showed me a folder, archived emails, messages between Graham and the board from 6 months before I was let go. Subject lines like Legacy Staff Reduction Plan and Phase 1, Hail Exit Strategy. Graham had been orchestrating my departure for months, positioning it as a cost-saving measure, promising that younger engineers could replace me and that the infrastructure I built could be phased out and migrated within 6 months. He claimed, I had intentionally made the systems unnecessarily complex to stay indispensable. Alan scrolled to one particular line in a board report. Victor Hale has created technical debt by design, not necessity. Replacing him now will allow for simplification and modernization. I stared at the screen, numb. I told you they didn't understand, Alan said. But this was malicious. I leaned back, my appetite gone. Why are you showing me this? He closed the laptop. Because I quit yesterday, and I'm not the only one. Half the IT department's gone. The consultants Veltria brought don't know what they're looking at, and now Westbrook is threatening to terminate their contract. That got my attention. Westbrook is 1/3 of their revenue, I said. If they walk, they're done, Alan finished. Graham's scrambling. That afternoon I got another call from Veltria. This time it wasn't HR, it was Graham himself. Victor, the board wants to make this right, he said, voice tense. They're prepared to offer you the CTO role. Full salary restoration, a signing bonus. You'll have full control over the rebuild. I didn't even pretend to think it over. No. Victor, this isn't about pride. We need you. The system is failing. You didn't value me when it mattered, I said. Now you're asking me to rebuild what you broke. There was silence on the line. Then, the turn I knew would come. If we discover that elements of the system were intentionally undocumented, there could be legal implications. Intellectual property concerns. You signed a non-compete, Victor. We could make this very messy. I smiled without humor. The system is exactly as it was when I asked for a documentation team and was denied. Again and again. Every line of code belongs to Veltria per my contract. But the understanding of how it all fits together, that lives in my head, and that isn't something you can subpoena. I heard his breath catch. You can have your lawyers contact mine, I added. Then hung up. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a different kind of anger, a deeper one. The kind that only shows up when someone accuses you of sabotage for doing your job well. That night, I walked along the lake with Elaine. The moon was low, the water still. You okay? She asked. Getting there. Was it hard? Saying no. I shook my head. Not even a little. Veltria hadn't just lost a system. They'd lost the person who gave a damn. 2 months into my new role at Devlin, Lawrence called me into his office. His tone was clipped but electric. "Jeffrey, Westbrook just got off the phone with me." That name hit like a hammer. "CEO of Westbrook Properties, the client that made up nearly a third of Veltria's revenue. He's officially terminating their contract with Veltria," Lawrence said. "They want to know if we can handle their entire portfolio, all of it." I blinked. "That would double our infrastructure, maybe more." "I know," so I asked him what his timeline was. Lawrence leaned back, watching me carefully. He said 12 weeks. "He's desperate. Tenants are filing complaints. Payments are bouncing. They can't afford another quarter of Veltria's systems collapsing." I exhaled slowly. 12 weeks is tight. What would it take? I didn't answer right away. My brain was already moving. Mapping nodes, bandwidth constraints, data migration timelines, user permission tiers. I opened my notebook and started sketching. We'd need 3 more senior engineers, dedicated servers, not just cloud, a hybrid architecture for transitional load balancing, and full documentation from day one. Lawrence smiled. "You had me until documentation." I didn't smile back. "That's not optional. It's why Veltria failed." He nodded once. "Then it's done." The next morning, we posted hiring notices. I called Alan and offered him the lead database architect role. He accepted before I finished the sentence. By the end of the week, 2 more former Veltria engineers had joined us. They weren't bitter, just relieved to be working somewhere that respected experience. Over the next 10 weeks, we built something I hadn't seen in years, a team that trusted each other, engineers who asked questions, documented as they went, cross-checked each other's logic, a system that didn't just work, it explained itself. I ran a phased rollout plan by Lawrence, starting with Westbrook's smallest region. 2,000, it's in upstate New York. We'd onboard them first, then cascade the migration region by region, validating as we went. It launched without a hiccup. A week later, the second region followed. Then the third. By week 10, every property Westbrook owned was running on the system I'd built. That Friday, Lawrence called me into his office again. This time, I wasn't alone. Seated at the table was Jeffrey Westbrook himself. He stood, shook my hand. "So you're the one behind this," he said. "Guilty," he smiled. "We haven't had a single major issue since the migration started. Our tenants are happy. My regional managers think I'm a genius, but I know better." "Glad to help," I said. "We built it to last. I heard you used to work for Veltria." I nodded. "They're in bad shape," he said. "No serious buyers left, except one." I looked at Lawrence. He nodded. "We're considering an offer at a fraction of what the company was valued at 6 months ago. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be in a position to buy back the company that fired me, I would have laughed. But here we were. If the acquisition goes through," Lawrence said, "we'd want someone to oversee the system integration. Someone who knows both infrastructures." "You're asking if I'd lead it?" "Yes, but only if you want to." I paused. The idea of walking back into Veltria's building under a different banner wasn't appealing for revenge. It was appealing. "For closure, I'll do it," I said. "On one condition." Lawrence raised an eyebrow. "We do it right, full documentation, proper training, no shortcuts, no tech debt we'll be cleaning up in 5 years. He extended a hand. Agreed. 3 months later, I stood in the server room of what used to be Veltria Housing's headquarters. The sign on the door now read, Devlin Integrated Property Management. The racks of hardware I'd once maintained still blinked with activity, but not for long. The new infrastructure I'd built would replace it all within the year. Lawrence stood beside me. "Want to go in?" he asked. I looked through the glass one last time. "No need," I said. "We won't need this." 1 year after the acquisition, Devlin Integrated Property Management became the largest property tech company in the Northeast. The Veltria migration was complete. Every legacy system phased out. Every property onboarded. Every node documented. Every process mapped. Every engineer trained. We didn't just fix things. We rebuilt them the right way. The real achievement, though, wasn't the code. It was the culture. Engineers asked questions now. They wrote clean documentation. They trained one another. They didn't just build systems, they built teams that could survive change. Which is why, when Lawrence asked if I planned to stay in my integration role, I told him no. I had something else in mind. I pitched him a new division, Devlin Technical Education, a program to train the next generation of systems architects, not just developers but real builders. People who understood not just how to code, but how to design infrastructure that could survive executive turnover, scaling, mergers, life. Lawrence didn't hesitate. Build it. The board approved it the next quarter. I hired instructors. I designed the curriculum. I made sure no one would ever be told next quarter when they asked for documentation training. We didn't teach shortcuts. We taught systems thinking, integrity, accountability, the kind of things you don't always find in job descriptions, but you always find in strong foundations. One afternoon, as I was finalizing the program schedule, I heard a knock at my door. Justin, Bayou. I hadn't seen him since the acquisition. He looked older, less polished, humble even. He stepped in, holding a cup of coffee he clearly hadn't touched. Got a minute? He asked. We stepped outside into the courtyard. It was late autumn. The air crisp, the trees along the walk ablaze with red and orange. My father asked about you, Justin said. He's retired in Florida now, fishes most mornings, still reads the trades. I smiled. How's he doing? He's good. He was glad to hear you were back. In a way. I nodded. So was I. Justin paused. He always said letting you go would be the biggest mistake this company could make. For a moment I didn't know what to say. He was right, Justin added quietly. We stood there in silence, watching the wind shake loose a few more golden leaves. Later that day, I packed up my old integration office. My third office in this company if you count the one I started in 18 years ago. This time, it wasn't about cleaning out a legacy. It was about moving into something new. Elaine met me outside the building. We took the long way home, following the lake road. The shore glittered under the autumn sun. Maples and oaks lined the horizon, fire bright and swaying. As we drove, I thought about everything, not just Veltria or Graham or what they'd done. I thought about systems, about how so much of life is held together by things people don't see. Invisible architecture, the care behind the curtain, the integrity in things done quietly and well. I thought about how I never wanted revenge. I wanted something better. I wanted something that lasted. As we rounded the bend by the water, I looked out at the lake one last time before winter came. Didn't need to win. I just needed to show what good work looks like and let it speak for itself.